Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this iMove webinar. This webinar will feature one of iMove's important recently completed projects that looked at managing transport system investment risk as a response to changing technology in the transport sector. I'm Ian Christensen. I'm the Managing Director of iMove, but I'm going to now hand you over to the host of the webinar, Professor Sharon Bierman. Sharon is a director of the Planning and Transport Research Centre, shortly known as PATRIC, which is based at the University of Western Australia. And she plays a leading role in the formation of iMove projects in Western Australia. She is going to introduce the project to you and to introduce to you the many researchers that made an important contribution. Sharon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ian, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thanks for joining us. Without further ado, I'm just going to introduce you to the project. So as Ian said, Planning and Transport Research Centre is what we're all about. We are a collaboration between Western Australia state government departments and also 3 local universities, and the centre is hosted by UWA. The mandate is to conduct applied research and teaching in support of policy in the connected spaces of transport and land use planning. The focus areas for research are integrated land use and transport futures, smarter travel decisions, freight system optimization, emerging technologies and network optimization, and then the focus area which we're talking about today, transport infrastructure investment, risk management. When we came to define this project, we worked with our policy stakeholders to determine what the context is for a lot of our transport policy and planning activities. And what we noted is that this is changing very much so in terms of a high rate of technological advancement, changes in consumer demand and behavior, and also changing and emerging new transport business models. Decisions are increasingly needing to be made in an environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this presents both risks and opportunities. So what the project set out to do was to look at how we can improve existing practice and process to ensure that our decision makers have the best possible advice. The specific focus, and we selected 4 particular areas to look at adapting portfolio-wide strategic infrastructure investment planning and management tools, guidelines, and frameworks to account for these changes and uncertainties. These 4 areas that we are zooming into in this project, and then also in the presentation today, is looking at how patronage is changing and what's affecting this patronage change and how that affects our prediction and forecasting of patronage. We look at digital journey planning tools and what the impacts are on our transport system. We look at asset management guidelines and practice and look at how these need to be adapted for taking into account our changing environment. And then lastly, looking at our project assessment and prioritization frameworks. The people, so you've heard that as a collaboration. So what we'll show you today is a collaboration between our government partners who participate in the form of steering committees, and they really are very supportive and spend a lot of time working with us to make sure that the research is directed at what their policy needs are. You'll also see that some of the projects are between different universities in the area. And although only the lead researcher will be presenting today, they will probably mention to you that the research has been done in collaboration. The process that follows now is I'll introduce you to each of the speakers individually. They will have 10 minutes to present, and then there are about 2 minutes for some questions and answers. Please use the Q&A function, and we'll monitor those and forward them to the presenter. Then once we've had 4 of those presentations and questions and answers, Ian will quickly close. And as you will have seen, we are recording this, and it will be made available on the iMove website probably tomorrow. So without further ado, let me hand over to Brett Smith, who's Dr. Brett Smith is a senior lecturer focusing on at UWA in the business school, and his priority research focus is on travel behavior research. Brett, over to you to handle the presentation, and you have 10 minutes.
I'm sticking. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now and into presentation mode. All right. As Sharon mentioned, our part of the project was to look at, basically the real reason was there was a growth in public transport demand from about 2009 to 2014. Then it dipped, but never really recovered, and the authorities wanted to know, what were the reasons behind that, and trying to understand that lack of recovery, or why public transport was down so much. And I guess it's also relevant now in the sort of heading out of COVID in Western Australia. The public transport hasn't recovered quite as much. So I think the best way to say it, we did a lot of different techniques using secondary data. So we couldn't question people or have direct insight with customers or patrons, but using data that was made available to us from the Public Transport Authority. So Tristan looked at just getting that data and putting it all together. The 2 presentations I'll do today is on the regression-based behavioural models that I undertook, and the pattern discovery, or the unsupervised learning at the level of the hub, I guess we'll be talking about. There was some other interesting things that went on. Doina tried to put together about 40,000 different records and map the growth in space, which I won't talk about today. And then we had a secondary part of the research was to look more at the spatial side and the regressions using spatial models. And again, I'll give some results from that, but I won't talk you through the method. And finally, using the smart card rider data, looking at customer churn in the public transport sector. And again, I'll give some results, but not talk about the methods. So our first method we'll talk about is the econometric models, which is basically just looking at the transport data over time for different segments or sectors of ticket holders, and trying to work out what are the influencing factors on the levels of patronage in that transport sector. We divided the region up into roughly, I think it was 15 sectors, but collapsed a few in the end. These roughly correspond to our zonal system in Perth, zone 1 being inner, zone 2 being middle, and all other zones being outer, and correspond also to the main railway networks. So that's how we divided up the space. We had suburb level data, so we couldn't actually just match the zones because we didn't have that level of detail, just trips that originated and or terminated at the suburb level. So some nice pretty pictures. This is all the spatial sectors of public transport. And we'll just look at the Midland here. I think it's Middle Mandurah, sorry, one of our major transport routes. You can see that the growth is quite strong leading up to 2013. And then you can, different ways you can see it, but when the mining bus came, so too did the public transport bus, and there was a dip. All right, and that's the main focus of today, is to look at what was driving the growth and what was causing the dip. Let's start here. The first interesting thing is that these are trips that we call commuting, that is started anywhere within the city but terminated in the morning, AM commute, in the inner zone. So Perth, Subiaco, UWA, around Perth. Trips that were longer, starting from the outer sector, were more price responsive. So that was the first thing that we found, and I think the state authority has made use of these elasticities in determining some policy decisions, realising that longer commutes are more price sensitive. And it also shows up here is that when we're thinking about what's important, the most important thing is the level of service or the supply of public transport. So that's the most important factor. In terms of a ratio to importance, so these are just sensitivities. In terms of ratio of importance, you can see the inner sector is far less, or is more responsive to economic factors such as vacancies, unemployment, the state national product. The change in demand was for the inner sector was far more responsive to those factors than to fare. Whereas when we looked further out, the fare was the driving factor, was more important. And in terms of all trips, including standard fares are more important than economic factors. So the main learning from this was that for regions within 15 kilometres of the city, it was actually the economic activity that caused the change in demand. The second bit of research that I'll be talking about today is the performance of hubs. So this was done by Rachel Cardell Oliver, looking at certain hubs. One of the things she noticed that the impact of works on hubs, so if hubs had to close down, one particular was Edgewater, where they built some parking, and so the disruptions caused certain shifts in behaviour that never really recovered back to the same after. And for the hubs that didn't have any impact, one thing that Rachel found is that the way that the ridership changed at different hubs was quite peculiar to those hubs. So basically, she's created a cluster of sort of travel patterns, if you like, over a 3-year period. That's where we had the data for the Smart Rider data. And you can see here certain growth at UWA, Perth and Elizabeth Quay are growing over that period. But there are other stations, say, for example, Curtin University, Fremantle and Morley hubs, where the growth was negative or in decline. And perhaps one of the most revealing things is it wasn't, everybody's in the way of my screen now, it wasn't so much, it wasn't all traffic or all types of customers that changed within those at those hubs. You can see here at Midland, it's basically the tertiary and the high school students that were in decline much more than tertiary and standard, much more than whatever the blue one is, which I cannot see. And it's also shown up here in sort of tracking the days. If we just take 2016, you can see here March, when the university's open, there's a high level of intensity or activity at Morley. Then in 2017, it's a lot cooler, I guess. And then 2018, cooler and cooler still. And this, maybe for my university colleagues, might be reflective of the way that students engage with universities over the last 2 years.
Brett, 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Okay, so in summary, from the patterns, or from all the models, so we'll give the summary, the one that I talked about here with the econometric model, longer commutes are more price sensitive, and inner zone patronage was more responsive to the macro conditions or the economic conditions. The other things that we found is looking at the spatial models, there were some areas, particularly near the coast in the north and south suburbs. So we might think of just south of Fremantle and in and around, I guess, Karrinyup area, where there's a good supply of public transport, but not much patronage. So that's one of the things that we uncovered with there. And we did some prediction on that, which I haven't presented here. And the other thing is that as we know from international studies, that part of the public transport sector that's not commute, not the part that I was talking about today, has a negative income elasticity, and areas with lower income have higher patronage. In terms of the transport hubs, not all hubs are the same. Changes in demand are often dominated by a single patronage type. And not presented today, but one of the things that Rachel found is that there's a fair bit of churn within the public transport. Only about 50% of card holders stayed within the system as regular users over a 3-year period. The other regular users of public transport either appeared or disappeared in that 3-year period. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett. And there's a question here for you, and we've probably just got time for one. For the dip in slide 7, was the public transport dip compared against general traffic volumes? Given you mentioned it might have been due to the mining bust. I assume there wasn't, but just checking.
Yeah. So no, that's a good question. What we didn't have was traffic level data at that time in 2013, but what we did manage to get was some insight into traffic, and that we ran in our spatial models, and there's definitely a substitution effect. So where there are levels of congestion on the road, there's more likely to be higher public transport demand, and where there is less congestion, there's lower. So there's certainly a substitution effect.
Thanks, Brett. And then the last one, was it identified that greater placemaking and connectivity is a draw card for patronage at a particular station?
No. Well, not that I can recall. There was a lot of research done that would have probably fitted into Rachel's domain. But one of the interesting things, just, on that point, is that there was another bit of research that occurred at the same time, and they used data up to about 2016-17, showing that Morley was a good placemaker. But then what we found from 2016 with Rachel's work is that there was a strong decline in both sort of tertiary students and standard tickets at that place. What insights we can gather from that, I'm not sure, but maybe it's really the things that aren't local that are driving the public transport. So it's not just the hub, it's other things going on. This change in behaviour of tertiary students to not engage with their campus as much as they used to is probably more a driver than the place at Morley.
Good, thanks very much, Brett. Let's move on to Tristan Reid, who's from Curtin. He's a Patrick Research Fellow and probably spends more of his time sitting with Brett and Joyner at the business school at UWA, but good collaboration going there. Tristan was leading the part of the project looking at journey planning tools. Over to you, Tristan.
Thanks, Sharon, and let's hope I can get my screen shared all correctly. Oh, well, good morning or afternoon for those connecting from over East, and thank you all for coming and listening today. I'm going to be talking about, I guess, part of the project that I was primarily working on, which is a bit out of left field compared to some of the other, I guess, more traditional components in this project. So what I was looking at is actually the role of journey planner applications in influencing public transport patronage. And that is in, I guess, two different ways as well. Most people might think of journey planners as something that will drive patronage towards public transport, but taking a more holistic view of everything. There's also the consideration of journey planners assisting private vehicle travel, for example, by providing more accurate information to drivers that could nudge people to actually take the car when they might have been considering taking, say, the train instead. Much like Brett, since we're short on time, I'm not going to be able to show you absolutely everything that was covered in this project, but I will try and give you a little bit of background about it and briefly go through some of the results of the survey that was undertaken, which was, I guess, the primary component of this research. So for those who are unaware, journey planners are apps and websites. They could be on your phone, on a computer, any sort of computer system really that help you make decisions about where, when, and how to travel. I guess traditionally, many people probably think of them as really just navigation and travel time. So for example, if I'm trying to get from point A to point B, it will take me 20 minutes and I have to take this bus and this train or this road, the next road, and some other road to get there. That being said, in practice, journey planners these days have a lot more features which can help end users make travel decisions. Things such as notifications of disruptions as they occur, live data, which has become quite popular, as we'll see, quite well, certainly in Perth, but also, I guess, throughout Australia and the world. So actually tracking vehicles as they move through the network. Ticketing integration, something that we don't have, at least in Western Australia yet. And say from the example of private vehicle sort of view, we have camera locations in your Waze and similar apps there. So giving you an alert of when you're approaching, say, a speed camera or a red light camera. Didn't necessarily say all these features were for good. So we'll briefly look at a bit of a matrix of features a little bit later on in the presentation. But going back to the beginning, the purpose of this research was really to understand if increasing the availability and use of digital journey planners would contribute to a shift towards multimodal, shared or active trips. I guess what we would call the better modes, so to speak. Of course, a lot of investment goes into the road network, but a lot of investment also goes into the public transport network. And we know that there's many benefits in people using public transport over private vehicle. But also, again, looking at it almost backwards in a lot of ways to what many people might think, and whether journey planners actually reinforce existing mode choices. So as I briefly mentioned before, in the case of many private vehicle journey planners, whether actually getting more information and more accurate information about your trip is actually making you think, actually the car's not that bad, the congestion's not that bad, maybe I will drive, whereas before you might not have known exactly what kind of congestion was out there and therefore thought, well, the bus is probably going to be quicker today, I'll take that. So it's looking at it from both ways in this research here. So that obviously follows on to the next point of, well, if the journey planner is helping you make a decision to take one mode or another, well, what part of it is doing that? So of course, as we saw on that last slide, and as I'll show you in a second, there are many, many features within journey planners. There are many, many journey planners in the market, especially depending on where you call the boundaries. You can certainly make the argument that there's journey planners even for aviation, for example, that allow you to plan trips involving segments taken on the plane. In research, I found some maritime journey planners, so obviously helps you plan your journey if you've got a boat. And then our more traditional ones giving you guidance to create a trip with your car or with public transport or active travel. So To start off with, one of the components that was undertaken was a bit of a market analysis. So looking through, downloading a very long list of popular journey planners and scouring the web for some as well. Finding some of the more popular journey planners that are on the market for either the iOS, the Apple system, Android, or on the web. This table is probably not too readable, and we don't really have the time to actually go through it in detail anyway. But the point I wanted to make by including this table is that we can see there's actually a fair bit of diversity there in what features these journey planners contain and what features they don't. So we can see past that third, that large section on the right there, different features in journey planners have been enumerated, and where the cells are colored green, the journey planner in question had that feature included, and where it's red, it didn't. So we can see that, for example, with some features, only 1 or 2 journey planners had that feature, whereas in others, almost all of them did. Interestingly, though, there doesn't seem to be one feature that every single journey planner has. We got close in a couple of cases, but even some journey planners, for example, didn't have basic navigation features. And the argument could be made that, you know, do we need to have that basic navigation feature to be called a journey planner? I took the approach that a journey planner is something that helps you design a journey. So even though it didn't necessarily provide navigation, it could provide, for example, the location of waypoints or something like that in the case of maritime navigation. So moving on from here, the next few slides are going to be some results from the survey that was undertaken of residents of Perth. So a computer-assisted telephone interview was undertaken with the ECU, well, by the ECU Survey Research Centre on 402 Perth residents. And really the aim of that was to understand in the real world how people are using journey planners. So are they using them frequently? What kind of journeys are they using them for? How are they using them? What would they like to see? As we'll go through, we'll see that depending on the slide, obviously, where the logic of the survey ended up, not every question was answered by every respondent. You know, there were some questions on public transport usage. If you had not used public transport, you were not asked that question. Since this survey was undertaken about a year ago, sort of around the end of the first lockdown in Perth, we just moved into out of lockdown, but into restrictions. So we thought it was also a good opportunity to sort of get a little bit of information about how people are moving during and before COVID. And we can see here, as expected, we had an increase in people working from home during COVID compared to before COVID. We had a decrease in pretty much every other mode. But we also looked at not just for work journeys, but also social and recreational journeys. And we can see there that there's actually quite a big bit of drop off there for especially the non-car modes, the social and recreational journeys during COVID. Having a look at how frequently people use journey planners, and that can be for any mode, we can see there that at least for Neville, we're only getting about 70 respondents out of 400, at least occasionally. Occasionally is the most common response there with 120, and we have quite a few more respondents very frequently and always. So even though people might not be using journey planners for every journey and losing out on things such as live data, which could affect their journey and how they would take their journey each time, people are at least consulting journey planners sometimes to help them plan their journey. And we'll see in a slide a little bit later on exactly how that pans out. Sharon, I know you're about to tell me 2 minutes, so I will hurry up a bit. On this slide, we're looking at which journey planners people use and on which platforms. By far, the most popular was Google Maps. Whether that's actually people also thinking it's Apple Maps and confusing it for Google Maps, as Google Maps used to be included in Apple, it's hard to tell. The Transperth Journey Planner itself is also quite popular. So there is definitely benefit in the government continuing to invest in their own journey planner. As far as which mode journey planners were utilised in, of course, journeys car by driver are the most voluminous in nature, and they were also the most common with utilising journey planners. That being said, we can see that bus and train here are a bit overrepresented compared to the mode share of public transport. Getting back to that frequency of use, we can see here that for familiar journeys, it's not very frequently. The yellow coloured ones are at least occasionally, and the dark ones are rarely or never. But for new journeys, it's almost about 90% of respondents do use them for new journeys. So it seems to me that People definitely do like to consult journey planners to plan new journeys, but they don't like to, once they've got something in their head, they're less likely to come back and improve that journey, even though, as we see on the next slide here, people are actually quite interested in live travel times, amongst other features such as the estimated travel time and navigation, but also the ability to find destinations when you're not quite sure exactly where you're going. Cost estimates and speed limits are also quite popular. As for things I'd like to see, most popular is the ability to book or pay ahead, as well as live information. Again, contrast with what we saw before, as well as alternate formats such as your Alexa and smart speakers and things like that, being able to use them to plan your journey. Unfortunately, though, we see in our last results slide here that despite all these changes, it's not very likely that people will actually change their behaviour. So while it might be helpful to nudge them, unfortunately, in practice, people, at least the way that they've reported themselves, they're not likely to actually change their behaviour based on these improvements. So overall, in summary, we can see that journey planners are actually quite popular. They're frequently used for new journeys, but not as much for recurring journeys. And that's despite the fact that people desire the live data, they still don't actually use it. Google Maps is quite popular, although it might actually just be misrepresented. Apple Maps, but also the Transperth app itself is quite popular too. Users want to interact with journey planners in new ways, things such as Alexa and Siri, be able to pay in advance and use digital wallets. And of course, in the context of crowding, COVID-19, crowding information is quite well requested as well. Unfortunately, behaviour change is harder. There was an interest in rewards system, which I didn't have time to discuss today, and that might be able to be used to nudge people to make different decisions, but there's been much research done in that area, and I think we know it's easier said than done. Finally, we can see journey planners are already popular for many modes, not just public, active and shared transport, but also for private vehicle as well. We can see that a third of respondents wanted to use journey planners on multimodal journeys, but most commonly used journey planners only provided single mode or public transport and walking abilities. And of course, multimodal journey planner is an essential element for moving towards mobility as a service, an enabler of that. So my apologies, I did talk a little bit too long, but thank you very much. Sharon?
Thank you, Tristan. And you have a question from David Henshaw, who's really happy to see some research on journey planners, since he says we are not convinced that they by themselves change travel behavior within mass. So his question is app convenient enough to change travel behavior that aligns with societal goals? I think you kind of answered some of that at the end, and not say, not good news, David, but David's really looking for some good evidence.
I think I'd have to concur with David there and say that the evidence from the surveys is sort of shown that, yeah, people will talk this up and say how much they like it. But when push comes to shove and they're asked, well, would these features actually help you make a different decision? The answer seems to be no. So I think these improved features in journey planners could certainly contribute towards a mode shift, but I think it's not going to be the only lever that would need to be pushed.
Good, thanks very much, Tristan. Let's move on to the third presentation now. Kerry Brown is from ECU, from the School of Business and Law. She's a professor of employment and industry, and very applicable to her talk today is program leader of governance and organizational planning at the Asset Institute. Kerry, over to you.
Hi, Sharon. It looks like Kerry's dropped offline, so maybe she hasn't got a very good connection at the moment. Oh, is she back? Kerry, can you hear us? We might be a good idea to go on with the next presentation and come back to Kerry at the end.
Thanks, Jackie. I think that's right. So let's move on to Dr. Psy Saichi, who is a Patrick Research Fellow. Her background is in civil engineering and transport economics. She works closely with our transport investment infrastructure team, and was looking at ways to adapt project prioritization processes and practices to better deal with uncertainty. So over to you, Psy.
Thank you, Sharon. I hope I'm sharing the right screen. So I have, in this part of this big project, I have looked at mainly the infrastructure planning. And this was really a small part of this massive project. And this is where my interest is. So hopefully it's an interest to many of the audience today. So just quickly, so it's going to be a 10-minute presentation. So apology for speaking very quickly. But today in the presentation, I'm just going to quickly go through what that look like when you say, when I say infrastructure investment planning, for those who are not from the background. And I'm going to talk about what kind of mobility and transport we'll be talking about. Then I'm going to talk about how I have looked at to try and assess the disruption due to those mobility and transport. Then I'm going to go through the findings today. So just quickly, how is investment decisions made for those infrastructure projects? And I'm mainly really talking about major projects. So these are $100 million plus investments, and these tend to go through state and federal level process. And if I take example, if you look at the Infrastructure Australia assessment framework, which actually has been updated and released very recently, but so I will be referring to the older version, apology, but often looks at a set of criteria. So in the old version, they look at strategic fit, deliverability, and the values in terms of economic, environmental, and social values. And that's very, very common across Australia and other countries as well. Now, if you're looking at major infrastructure projects, they often have very long assessment periods, so minimum 30 years and 30 years plus. And within the 30 years, you know that things can be different to how it is now. However, in the typical decision-making process, kind of presumes that things will continue to be used the way it is used now. So with that, uncertainties, future uncertainties are not assessed adequately. And that's where I'll be looking at today. So I don't use the term emerging technology because I'm actually looking at future mobility and transport. And what I mean is that currently we have public transport, cars and Uber and other types of shared mobility. But in the future, likely we'll have things like, mobility as a service, MaaS, and also a variety of different vehicle technologies. That includes the electric vehicles. I put it there as a future one because we don't have enough number of electric vehicles on our road yet. We have some, and also we might have AVs and also connected vehicles, whether that's connected between vehicle to vehicle and also vehicle to infrastructure. And so those are the type of things I looked at in this project. And if you look at disruption, how to assess disruption within the infrastructure planning, there is an established method already to assess the disruption, and that's shown in the figure on your left with the gray triangle, and that's how it's represented. So if you say y-axis is utilization and the x-axis is time, for example, if you take an example of flooding, the utilization of road sections are zero, and that causes the loss of utilization. And over time, road sections start to open up and that's where the triangle line is coming from, and eventually the utilization goes back to how it was. But if you look at disruption due to future mobility and transport, it looks more like the figure on your right. So the disruption doesn't happen overnight, just like how it was represented when it was, for example, things like flooding and so on. It happens over time. And also another thing is that the utilization can be lost, but also it can be increased. Depends on what you're looking at. For example, whether you're looking at shared mobility or whether you're looking at AVs that are not shared. But the thing is, it's still the same triangles. So that's why I looked at the existing methodology to assess the disruption. And if you look at different methods, there are things like stochastic analysis, real options analysis, MCS, so that's a multi-criteria assessment, and scenario testing and so on and so on. But the thing is, if you are looking at events that have historical data, so good data to back you up, you can do, stochastic analysis and other types of numerical analysis. But when it comes to FMT, obviously we don't have historical data. We have some case studies, but it's really, really unreliable, and the different locations obviously would be different. So what I will be looking at then is MCA and the scenario testing. Those are the good methodology to look at something that we don't know enough about. So as a demonstration, I've got a table here. And this is what I did for this project. But on your left-hand side, you have the set of criteria. Again, I'm using the old IA framework here, but basically you'll be looking at changes within those a set of criteria. And on the top, you have a set of scenario. I don't talk too much about what these scenarios are, but basically under different scenarios, you're looking at changes within that set of criteria. And on the top, I want to highlight that I've got changes in utilization, and that's basically looking at the demand. And I'll come back to that later. So once I did this demonstration, I have noticed a few things, and this might be sort of like a common sense, but it really validates where the uncertainties are coming from. So if you look at assessment outcomes, the assessment outcomes really depend on the nature of the work, nature of the project. So whether that project is a road project or bus or rail project, really depends on that. And again, I'll come back to that. And also another thing is whether the project has some sort of technology features in it. So whether it has some sort of improved journey planning tools or improving efficiency of operations using new technologies or not, those things really change the assessment outcome. And also another thing is whether that project is part of a more wider, bigger transport optimization program or some sort of service integration program. So whether, for example, things like Mars, whether the project is part of Mars scheme or not, that kind of thing really changes the outcome.
Psy, 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks. And also another thing I've noticed is that the uncertainty is great, especially for demand. So we know that if the demand is uncertain, everything else also becomes uncertain. So that kind of emphasizes that we do need to think about this, whether the methodology I used for this project specifically is appropriate or not. We need to think about this. And also another thing is the project that are inflexible in a way that can be used. So for example, if you look at road, once you build a road, it can be used by cars, pedestrians, cyclists, and all it takes is, you know, changing line marking, or maybe putting median strips or something like that to change the purpose, the use of the road. But for example, if you look at rail, it can really be used by rail trains, really. So it's those things are exposed to more uncertainties. And just the other two things are more on the methodology I use. But because I use the scenarios for this methodology, the comprehensiveness of the assessment really depends on the comprehensiveness of the scenario. So if the scenarios are not designed properly, it doesn't work properly. So regularly conducting detailed analysis to look at the recent trends, it's obviously important. But also another thing is we could identify triggers. So triggers, things like, let's say, AB uptake of, I don't know, 5% or something. Then we can say, oh, okay, that triggers analysis. So let's take a closer look. We could do that. And also another thing is, when should this assessment occur? Obviously, it has to happen sometime between options identification stage and business case assessment stage, but I have yet to find out exactly when, because at the business case assessment stage, it might be too late, but at the options identification stage, there might be some undecided matters that it might be difficult to do this kind of assessment. So that's all the findings, and that's the end of the slide. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing, show myself. Back to you, Sharon.
Thanks very much, Psy, for a whiz through that. Just to say that we haven't managed to get Kerry Brown back online.
I am.
So we'll take a question or two. Oh, there she is. Wonderful to see you, Kerry.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just go ahead with your presentation and we can take any questions at the end.
I'll set it up and see how we go, but you can take questions while I'm setting up.
Okay. So just in one sentence, Psy, what would you say to your colleagues in the Department of Transport in terms of what your findings have in terms of relevance for how they prioritize projects?
So again, this assessment of future uncertainty definitely needs to be done sometime within the process. So by the time they submit the very well advanced business case, this assessment should be done by then, so that we know what kind of uncertainties we are facing, particularly for major projects with the longer assessment period.
Thank you, Psy. Okay, Kerry, I did do you an introduction earlier, so hopefully that didn't get lost, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. We were looking at understanding asset management practice to see the implications for connected and autonomous vehicles. And I have the project team listed and our steering committee. And what we were looking at was two uptake scenarios. So what if we introduce more connected and autonomous vehicles onto our road system? What do we need to account for? And what happens at the less than 100% uptake? And what if every vehicle was a CAV? So we were also understanding through the International Standards Organization 6 key areas about asset management standards that we needed to consider in terms of strategy planning, legislative requirements, customer and stakeholder expectations, and understanding risk management. And so we also looked at understanding what the global expectations were and standards were about automation. And level 5 is what's considered to be the highest level of self-driving, but there's a range of autonomous operations that happened before that. And one of the issues that we found is that even though this is the global standards 1 to 5, there are vehicles operating today that can be adapted between the 3 and 4, even if they're not considered that at the initial stage, but that they can be adapted through technology, so that our roads are geared towards 1 and 2, but in fact our vehicles can be 3 to 4. And so this is one of the issues that needs to be reconciled. Another area that we looked at in terms of mapping this, we looked at understanding what happened in the literature, what were the requirements for asset management, and then understanding the asset management system and what do stakeholders know and feel about these changes, and how we can understand that within a policy and regulatory environment. And so for these following slides talk about those 6 factors and what we found in the literature and what we needed to be cognizant of in terms of the way the road system approaches, needs to approach connected and autonomous vehicles. And these are the definitions of those 6 areas, and we'll go into the implications. And so what we found is that what's lacking is that in CAVs particularly, we don't understand enough about the cyber frameworks that can be, particularly hacking, that can be surrounded around the contextual elements of vehicles being able to connect with each other. Now, vehicles connecting both with the road system and with each other, like as we heard in the previous presentations, there's enormous opportunity for that, and particularly around the safety issue, so that there's greater safety, but there's greater ability for cybersecurity issues to arise. So we need to be very careful about understanding what are the risks. Also, we understand that there are areas where we don't have national policies on these elements of road safety and the introduction of connected and autonomous vehicles into the road system. There is an expectation, and that's played out within the Delphi study that we did, that the road itself will be adaptable up to the 100%, so that we can mix autonomous and partly autonomous and conventional vehicles on a road system that we already have, but not at the 100%. And what that indicates is that we're not ready for this, and that at that tipping point, we will not be ready for the changes that are required, because there's an adaptation scenario that is expected. In strategy, we also see that there's connected and autonomous vehicles will be part of smart metering, smart freeways, and that data can be captured in asset management strategy. So there's an important link between understanding at a strategic level what we need to do with the road system and what actually happens on the road. We can also have opportunities for parking and pricing and losing the congestion. So there's ways that we've seen from overseas examples that will work within that scenario. That we're also it's a central issue that we need to have a way of dealing with in future town planning. So not often those go together. Asset management goes together, but the transit in town planning doesn't. It will revolutionise public transport and the opportunity for understanding prioritisation issues and perhaps road user charges because of the uptake of CAVs. So at a fully autonomous, you don't necessarily need a driver. So that really takes into account, well, what do we do with licensing? How do we deal with that registration aspect of road users? Because our road users are not necessarily going to be drivers. With stakeholder expectations, privacy is a huge issue. And we also need to think about understanding ride sharing and lack of public ownership of vehicles. And also we need to think about scenarios that are about emissions reduction. We also need to have ways to be able to look at understanding the vehicles that come into the Australian situation and adapt our policies and regulations, because some vehicles are actually highly autonomous, but our system does not acknowledge that. Also, in risk management, as we say, we're expecting that safety will be improved considerably, but that cybersecurity is an issue as well. So I just wanted to quickly say that we had a survey and focus group discussion, and we wanted to understand, well, what's the thinking on this? So there's an expectation that most asset management functions will be impacted by CAVs for all uptake levels, 100 and less than 100%, and those are the areas that is expected. But however, CAVs will uptake more on the travel mode behaviour, but not impact on the need to build new road infrastructure. There's some areas of uncertainty around car occupancy and peak times, and this is set out in the following diagram about mostly agreement, but some areas of disagreement. So what are the opportunities? The road safety, as I mentioned, decreasing carbon emissions and traffic congestions, and better integration across those intermodal areas, improved mobility actually because of the way you don't need to be a driver under license, and you can actually optimise your transport system. The areas of national standards are really important but neglected at this stage, and cybercrime also is very important. Conclusion, it will affect those areas that we have outlined, but we need to rethink some of our ways that we are moving towards 100%, particularly with the fact that vehicles are at higher levels now than what the standards across those 5 levels of uptake show, and that there are ways in which we need to think about car ownership and road use and markings on the road, and technology of the road for future, because we're only geared to change at the 100% level. We're not actually geared to change at that uptake level. That's it.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And David is on fire here again with 2 questions for you. I wonder what road pricing reform model you had in mind, possibly distance-based, and will there be a difference regardless of whether the CAV car is repositioning with no person in it or with people on board?
So the road, the first question is, it wasn't clear that there would need to be a change, if that's what I understand the question. And the second question is, if you could repeat it, please, Sharon.
Will there be a difference regardless of whether the CAV car is repositioning with a person in it or without a person on board?
There will be at the 100%. Like, that's the issue is we're not, the road system will need to change at the 100% level, but up until then, there's no appreciable change. There's issues about line marking, there's issues about signalling, and we already have areas of smart freeways, but the thinking is we don't need to change, and that I think needs rethinking. That's the issue that we came to.
Yeah, and then a final one from David, which is pretty challenging. How can CAVs reduce congestion without serious road pricing reform? That's probably a bit outside the asset management arena, but give it a go.
Yeah, the literature and the models that we saw in across the globe were that if you just have your vehicle come to you when you need it, you actually are doubling your journeys almost. So what the models look like are lack of private ownership of cars, so that you have a fleet of vehicles connected across like an Uber situation, but driverless. And so what that means is that congestion is about multiple occupancy of cars can't, you know, as you need it, like just in time method. But if you have your own car and you send it in and you don't want to pay for parking and you send it back again to a waiting area, that doesn't actually, that actually increases the use of cars. So it's really this model of 100% where there's lack of car ownership, private ownership, there's fleets using technology to have a just-in-time method for people who want to call up cars, and that's the high-level future or the extended level future of how that would play out. Because also people who are visually impaired, you know, there's a whole lot of people, there's a whole lot of access to driving that prevents people from having cars, whereas they can have cars under the scenario. At the moment, globally, there needs to be a driver. There's very little where there's autonomous vehicles interacting. China is one of the few examples where autonomous vehicles interact, and drones are used to use deliveries, for example. But that integration is a step too far for most communities and globally. And
then just a last very specific question from Daniel Suter. Was the headway gap and hence capacity of a lane taken into account?
In terms of understanding what we need for the future, it's really around the line markings. So the width of roads, no, we didn't take that into consideration.
I think unfortunately we will have to call this interesting session to a close, because we're already quite substantially over time. I'd like, on behalf of iMove, to thank Sharon and the panel for their really interesting and clearly provocative contributions, and thank you all to all the audience for participating. And we're happy for iMove will furnish any further questions you have and forward them on to the panelists, and we will email you all once with a link to the recording once the recording is available to you. So. Thank you all for your time and interesting contribution. I've got a gazillion questions that I would like to ask as well, but we're not going to get a chance to do that now. Thank you all, and we'll look forward to meeting you at the next one.